Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show, I wanted to talk about the Minnesota Vikings. And the Vikings right now, if you look at the NFC North standings, are sitting there at 3-5. They're still in the mix, but I feel like a lot of people are asking, Zach, why are you going to spend a whole segment talking about the Minnesota Vikings on today's show? And to give you guys a little bit of context, right? I actually was not too high on the Minnesota Vikings before the season started. I actually had them finishing 8-8. I didn't have them making the playoffs, but at the same time, I did get a lot of heat for that, and I was kind of like, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. I have the Packers winning the division, and I respect Mike Zimmer, and I respect Dalvin Cook, and even though Kirk Cousins isn't great, I think we could all agree he isn't awful, so I was kind of like, I don't know what I'm going to do with the Vikings, but then at the last second, I actually predicted them not to make the playoffs, and early in the season, it looked pretty good. They lost at home in Week 1 to the Packers, they lose to the Colts in Week 2, they lose to the Titans in Week 3, somehow get a win in Week 4, lose a heartbreaking game on Sunday Night Football to Seattle in Week 5, lose at home to the Falcons in Week 6, which pushed their record to 1-5. And then all of a sudden, the last two games, the Minnesota Vikings have played really well, beating Green Bay at Lambeau Field 28-22, and then at home last week, beating the Detroit Lions 34-20. And the first thing that I'll say about the Minnesota Vikings is this. Dalvin Cook is an absolute stud. What he's been able to do the last couple games have been absolutely remarkable. Listen to these two stat lines, right? Against the Packers, Dalvin went for 30 carries, 163 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And then against Detroit, in 22 carries, went for 206 and a touchdown. And I believe when Dalvin Cook is playing like that, he is very valuable to this Minnesota Viking team, and he deserves to be in that MVP conversation. But at the same time, I wanted to talk about the Minnesota Vikings and their playoff chances for this year and if they could still get in. Because looking at Minnesota's schedule, right now, they are sitting with a record of 3-5. And when you look at the NFC, as crazy as this may sound, the wild card picture isn't nearly as crowded as it is in the AFC. I think we could all agree that only one team from the NFC East is going to be making the playoffs this year. I think we could have a pretty good feeling that in the NFC West, 2 to 3 teams may make it. Arizona and the Rams, especially if the Rams could somehow, some way get a win over Seattle on Sunday, that would be a really good sign for the Minnesota Vikings. But I think right now, there's a pretty good chance 3 teams from the NFC West make it, but not 1,000%. I think if I'm the Vikings, I would feel pretty confident if I could win this game on Monday Night Football that we could beat the Bears and jump them in the standings. And then in the NFC South, I think we could all agree 2 teams will be making it. So that means when you look at the following teams, right? Whoever comes out of the NFC East, Seattle, Arizona, the Rams, the Packers, the Vikings, the Saints, and the Bucks. Only one of those teams then wouldn't be able to make it. And Minnesota, looking at their schedule, their next couple games are this. At the Bears, home Dallas, home Carolina, and home Jacksonville. If the Minnesota Vikings could win that game on Monday Night Football against the Chicago Bears, I think they're going to be, in a really good position going forward to make the playoffs. And it's crazy because I remember after Minnesota lost to Seattle and after Minnesota lost to Atlanta, there were people saying that Mike Zimmer could legitimately get fired after the season. And to be honest, I never bought those. Mike Zimmer brought the Vikings to the playoffs last year. I think overall, since he's became the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, he's done a pretty good job leading this team in the right direction and making progress year after year after year. My only thing is, hopefully he could be a little more consistent, and I think if you're a Viking fan, you have to hope that consistency starts this week against the Chicago Bears, because I'm going to run some stats by you guys that I find very interesting. Historically, Kirk Cousins does not beat the Bears. And I remember last year they had a game in Chicago where Chase Daniel even came into the game for the Bears and ended up winning the game for them, and Kirk Cousins against that Bears defense still was just not able to get anything done at all. But at the same time, I think it's pretty fascinating that the Vikings have claimed 2 division wins in a row coming out of their bye week. And looking at it, in the first 6 games of the season, Minnesota was outscored by 37 combined points, but then outscored in their last 2 games, Green Bay and Detroit by 20. Perhaps the biggest factor is the Vikings went from -7 in turnover differential in their first 6 games to a +4 in the past 2. The Bears have dropped 3 in a row, and Chicago wants to stop the skid on the way to their bye week. But whoever turns the ball least in this game is going to lose, because that's what it's going to come down to. Both of these teams right now are going in two totally different directions. So if you're Minnesota and you just don't turn the ball over, you should hopefully be good. But at the same time, I do think you may have to realize that, wow, Kirk Cousins historically has not faced the Chicago Bears very well at all. And here's the other thing. Kirk Cousins has delivered high efficiency and turnover-free football in his first two games since the bye. He has the opportunity to continue that and remove that Monday Night Football monkey from his back while notching his first win against the Bears as a Viking. And it's almost an absolute certainty that Cousins' 0-9 record as a starter on Monday Night Football, which obviously also includes his time in Washington, will be brought up this week. Fair or not, wins and losses are always tied to quarterbacks, but Cousins has solid statistics in those contests. NFL media research has him averaging 252.8 yards per game and a passer rating of 89.5. He has also thrown 12 touchdowns against 6 interceptions in that game. Cousins in his career also is 7-3-1 against Green Bay and Detroit since joining Minnesota, and he's 0-3 against the Bears since 2018, which is one of my main concerns going into this game. I think when you look at this game for the Minnesota Vikings, Kirk Cousins really has the opportunity to just overall silence a lot of critics, because not only historically can he not win on Monday Night Football, but historically he really can't beat the Bears either. So when you look at this game for Minnesota, this is a season-defining game. I think if they could somehow, some way, find a way to win going into their next couple games, they're really not that bad. Home Dallas, home Carolina, home Jacksonville. All 3 games at home for Minnesota following this one, and then they'll go to Tampa Bay, they'll host Chicago, they'll go to New Orleans, and then go to Detroit. So the Minnesota Vikings are going to be a team that has a lot of big games for them coming up, and I'm curious to see how exactly Mike Zimmer goes with that, because Mike Zimmer, he's the kind of guy, a no-nonsense coach. And the other thing for Minnesota is that I'm looking at in this game is their special teams, because over the last couple of games, they really haven't been good on that unit of the ball at all. That they also allowed 2 punts blocked by the Lions, and the questions expanded this week when long snapper Austin Cutting was placed on the COVID injured reserve. So that's another thing to look at in this game. But Minnesota, since 2000, are 4-16 in games at Soldier Field. The victories include a 12-point win in 2000 and 3-pointers on decisive field goals in the final 12 seconds of the game or fewer in 2007, 2015, and 2017. Minnesota has had no fewer than 147 rushing yards in any of those victories. The Vikings are averaging 160.4 rushing yards per game right now, which is good for third in the NFL, while the Bears are allowing an average of 116.9 yards per game on the ground, which is 14th in the NFL. So looking at the Chicago Bears and the Minnesota Vikings, it's going to be a pretty huge game, because these two teams, they're division rivals, they don't like each other, and I think the stakes are pretty good. A lot of people are going to say and complain, oh, the Chicago Bears, no one wants to watch them in primetime, and I get it. Nick Foles and Mitch Trubisky, whoever's at quarterback, they're just not playing great right now. But at the same time, somehow, some way, this Chicago Bears team is still right in that race at 5-4, and if they could win, then they really are going to carry that momentum into their next 3-game stretch. And here's the other thing. I think the Vikings are a team that, when you look at other teams, those other teams aren't coming into the game anymore thinking that the Vikings are the double-A gap team. So you're getting some utility out of it. And it's surprising again to people, which is very good. I think Mike Zimmer has done a nice job using guys like Hercules Mataafa and Jalen Holmes on defense, and really getting those guys and using them to generate pressure, and more pressure than he used to be able to get with Linval Joseph and Everson Griffin and Hunter, to just go beat a guy, and they would just do good enough. You didn't really have to scheme out anything. But now I do think Mike Zimmer is figuring out a scheme where he can coach with his personnel, and after a few weeks of watching these guys play and getting more familiar with their strengths and stuff, especially without a preseason, here's the thing. I think Mike Zimmer is doing a really good job coaching this team. I think he's coaching out of his mind, And I think he's having a nice positive effect on this team with a roster that's pretty decimated right now. And the idea that Mike Zimmer isn't coaching well enough right now, to me, is absurd. I think he's doing a really good job, and I think he makes sense for this Minnesota Viking team to lead them to possibly new heights, because the Minnesota Vikings, they were 1-6. It is very hard to have your whole team and your whole locker room buy into your idea of a winning culture when your team has that kind of record. It's hard, I get it. But at the same time, I'm going to have to really give this guy credit, because he's done whatever he's had to do in order to get this team locked in order to use guys that, to be honest, no one's ever heard of, Hercules Mataafa and Jalen Holmes. So he's done a really good job, and I'm looking forward to the game on Monday night. I think it's going to be a fascinating game. I'm always down to see the NFC North, everything that goes on in that division. The Chicago Bears, I feel like over the last couple of years, have been in a lot of these games where their defense is playing well enough and could easily be the main reason why they won. But at the same time, their offense is just so historically bad that they really need more from that side of the ball. They need more from the offensive side of the ball. And it's crazy because both of these teams right now are just going in two totally different directions. If you would have told me that the Chicago Bears would have made the playoffs, I'd be pretty surprised. If you would tell me the Minnesota Vikings would make the playoffs right now, I wouldn't be surprised at all. One of these two teams is 5-3. The other one is 3-5. Take a guess which one is which. And that's the thing that is so crazy to me. So Bears and Vikings, Monday Night Football. It should be a good one. I'm really looking forward to it. And anyone who thinks Mike Zimmer is not doing a good job since he's taken over as the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, I just disagree with that. I think he always has his team ready to play. He always has his team somewhat in the mix, and it's going to be interesting to see how the Vikings will do going forward.